On a seemingly ordinary night, a woman discovers that for the man she loved, she was never enough, just too ordinary for the world he idealized. Without scandals, without public tears, she makes a silent decision that will change everything, disappearing so cleanly that it seems she never existed. While he continues confident in his own superiority, a sequence of events begins to erode everything he believed he controlled. And when the consequences finally arrive, they reveal a disturbing truth. Sometimes the one you underestimate is the one who understands exactly where everything can crumble. Before diving into this story full of twists, wounded pride, and unexpected consequences, subscribe to the channel now so you don't miss any more impactful reports like this one. The city never stopped. São Paulo breathed at a fast pace, its lights multiplying in the glass of skyscrapers as the night took over the horizon. And amidst this constant pulse, Mariana Vasconcelos crossed Avenida Paulista by bus, looking through the foggy window with that habitual expression of someone who observes the world with more care than she makes a point of showing. 32 years old, a market data analysis specialist for a medium-sized consultancy, Mariana did not have the profile that most would associate with an influential person. She dressed well but without ostentation. She spoke little in meetings, but what she said was usually the most precise in the room. Her boss had learned this in the first 3 months. Her colleagues took a little longer. The relationship with Raphael Drummond had begun so naturally that she could hardly point to an exact moment when things had changed tone between them. He was an account manager at a respected advertising agency, Vertice, one of the most talked about among communication professionals in São Paulo. Raphael had the kind of presence that filled a room, tall, well-articulated, with that smile that arrived before the words. They had met at a marketing networking event, and she had found it funny that he was the only one to make a joke about how no one at networking really wanted to do networking. For 6 months it worked. Discreet dinners, lazy weekends, conversations that went from consumer trend analysis to Javan's discography. He spoke of work with genuine enthusiasm, and she listened with that detailed attention that he mistook for pure admiration. It was admiration, yes, but it was also analysis. Mariana never completely turned off observation mode. It was what made her good at what she did. The first fracture appeared so subtly that she almost didn't register it. It began with small adjustments of context. When he introduced her to close friends, the tone was warm. When he introduced her to work colleagues, there was an almost imperceptible pause before the "she's my girlfriend," as if he needed an extra second to decide what that meant in that specific context. She filed this observation in the place where she kept everything that wasn't ready to be processed. The night of the corporate event arrived on a Thursday in May, with that dry cold that São Paulo knows how to produce when it wants to intimidate. Vertice was celebrating 10 years with a cocktail party on the terrace of the Fasano Hotel, and Raphael had insisted that she accompany him. Mariana chose a dark green dress that she knew looked good, pinned her hair up with calculated carelessness, and went. The environment was exactly what she expected, sophisticated, a bit performative, full of people who seemed to be always slightly turned toward where there was more visibility. Correct champagne, jazz music at the right volume so as not to hinder conversations, and that mist of elegant ambition that permeated events in the sector. Raphael circulated with ease. She accompanied him for a while, then stood near the buffet, observing. It was her way. She understood the dynamics of an environment better when she wasn't at the center of them. That was when she saw her. Isabella Coutinho entered like someone who knows every inch of the space she occupies. Dark hair tied in a low bun, a structured, tailored blazer, a smile that wasn't exactly for anyone, but seemed destined for everyone. Mariana didn't know who she was, but the room reacted to her presence in a specific way. Conversations didn't stop, but attentions reorganized themselves. Raphael was the first to approach her, and when the two greeted each other, Mariana recognized, with the same precision with which she recognized patterns in spreadsheets, that hug was not between former colleagues. It was between ex-boyfriends who still kept something unresolved between them. She observed the scene for exactly 4 minutes. Raphael laughed in a way she rarely heard. Isabella touched his arm lightly when she wanted to make a point. The two spoke of work, she could tell by their posture, But there was another layer to the conversation, a lower frequency that gestures betrayed without words needing to say it. Mariana took a glass of sparkling water and waited. When Raphael finally returned to her, there was something different in the way he looked at her. It wasn't a lack of love, it was comparison. And she knew with the cold clarity of someone reading data that a conclusion had been drawn in the last 20 minutes without her having been consulted. The night continued with that surface tension intact. She talked to two people from the market research sector, exchanged cards, asked intelligent questions. She fulfilled the event as if everything were normal, but a part of her was already processing. In the taxi back, Raphael was quiet for too long, and the silence had the texture of a decision already made. When they arrived at his apartment in Itaim Bibi, he went straight to the point, without apparent cruelty, but also without the slightest hesitation. He said he had thought a lot, that Isabella had said something that made him reflect on what he wanted for the future, that he admired Mariana, genuinely, but that he needed someone more aligned with the world in which he lived, someone who made sense in that environment in a natural way. He didn't say she was inferior, he said she was too ordinary for his world. Mariana listened until the end. She didn't interrupt, she didn't cry, she didn't raise her voice. When he finished, she took her bag, checked if she had forgotten anything, and went to the door. She turned only once, with her hand already on the doorknob, and said she appreciated the honesty. And she left. In the early hours of that morning, still on the subway back to Brooklyn, she thought of a specific thing that Raphael had shared with her weeks before, with that enthusiasm of someone who trusts too much in the person beside them. A campaign, a huge project, and the name of the person who was leading all of it, Isabella Coutinho. Mariana leaned her head against the cold window of the carriage and closed her eyes for a moment, not with anger, with attention. Mariana Vasconcelos woke up the next morning at exactly 6:15 as always. She made coffee, ate toast with cream cheese, reviewed work emails, and left for the bus stop with the same brown leather bag as always. To anyone seeing her from a window, it was a Thursday like any other. There was no visible trace that something had collapsed the day before. But inside, Mariana operated on two simultaneous planes. The first was that of functional life. Meetings, reports, the consumer segmentation analysis project that needed to be delivered by Friday. The second was quieter and more precise. It was the plane where she organized what she knew, what she had observed, and what she still needed to understand. Raphael had been careless with information, not out of malice. He was the type of person who confused intimacy with permission, who thought that sharing professional secrets was a form of bonding. In 6 months, she had heard more about the backstage of Vertis than many of the agency's employees probably knew, and the big campaign was the center of everything. Months before, on a night when the two were at her apartment watching a documentary on consumer behavior, Raphael had lowered the television volume with that air of someone about to reveal something important. He said that Vertice was about to launch something that would change the way the market saw the agency. A national campaign for a premium cosmetics brand, Loose, which was trying to reposition itself among young urban consumers. The differentiator, according to Raphael, was that the campaign would be entirely sustained by a narrative of spontaneous movement. No declared advertising. The idea was to create the feeling that real women, without apparent sponsorship, were discovering and loving Loose products organically. Micro-influencers, apparently personal posts, testimonials that seemed spontaneous, but were scripted and paid for covertly. In itself, the practice was not unprecedented in the sector, but there was a detail that made the case different. Loose had publicly committed, in a recent interview by its communications director, to never use veiled advertising. It had made this a point of brand differentiation, almost a manifesto. And now it was about to do exactly the opposite. Raphael had told all this with enthusiasm. He said that Isabella Coutinho, creative director at Vertice, was the mind behind the concept, that the project was bold, risky, but that if it worked, it would place the agency on a different level. Mariana had listened without commenting much. She had asked only one question: what if someone found out before the launch? Raphael shrugged and said that was the game, that the whole sector knew how it worked. She hadn't thought about it more at that time. She had filed it as she filed everything. But now, the file was open. At lunchtime, instead of going to the restaurant with colleagues, Mariana stayed in the empty meeting room with her laptop and a cup of coffee. She wasn't seeking privileged information. She was seeking confirmation. She wanted to see what was public, what was documented, and what could be connected by someone from the outside with the right pieces. She found the Loose director's interview in a business portal from 3 months ago. The statement was clear. The brand committed to total transparency in all its marketing communications. No undeclared advertising, paid influencers without identification, or manufactured movements. Next, she searched for Isabella Coutinho's profile. Impeccable LinkedIn, a degree in communication from ESPM, branding specialization in London, an upward trajectory in major agencies before Vertice. Professional photography with that look of someone who is always 3 steps ahead. Published articles on authenticity in modern communication. Mariana reread one of them twice, with specific attention to the vocabulary. Then she looked at the social media of the micro-influencers who had already begun to appear with subtle mentions of Loose. There was something too uniform in the tone, a certain similarity in narrative structure that was not a creative coincidence. It was a briefing. She closed the laptop, finished her coffee, and went back to her desk. She hadn't made any decision yet, just mapped the terrain. That week, Mariana's life followed its normal rhythm on the outside. She attended meetings, delivered the segmentation report on time, had lunch with her colleague Patricia on Thursday, and answered family emails over the weekend. No one asked about Raphael. She wasn't in the habit of exposing relationships in the work environment, and her closest friends knew she processed things internally before speaking. The only person who noticed anything was Dora, her desk neighbor, who one afternoon looked at her and said, "You look different." Not sad. Different. Mariana replied that she had decided to go to sleep earlier. Dora didn't seem completely convinced, but let it pass. On Saturday, Mariana went for a walk in Ibirapuera Park as usual. It was her mental reorganization ritual, 2 kilometers at whatever pace her body asked for, without headphones, letting her thoughts arrange themselves. That day, her thoughts had a clear direction. Raphael had discarded her based on a comparison that did not favor her, that she understood. People made decisions based on context and social pressure all the time. What she couldn't ignore was the fact that the person he had realigned himself with was involved in something that Isabella herself, in a published article, would call dishonest. And there was a third element that Mariana had not yet fully processed. Loose had signed a partnership with a consumer rights organization months earlier. The project was precisely about transparency in advertising. If the campaign came to light, the implications went far beyond the agency's reputation. She stopped near the lake, looking at the ducks circling with that absurd calm of those who don't know they are observed. She thought there was something almost poetic in the fact that Isabella built an entire image of authenticity while orchestrating the exact opposite. It wasn't anger that Mariana felt. It was something colder and clearer than anger. It was the certainty that she possessed information that carried weight, and that there was a fundamental difference between using that information to get revenge and simply letting it reach where it needed to reach. The distinction was subtle, but for Mariana, it was everything. She went home, prepared a simple meal, and spent a long time looking at the ceiling before sleeping, not with anxiety. With the kind of calm that comes when you know exactly what you're going to do, but the right time to do it has not yet arrived. The time would come. Things always found their moment. The consultancy where Mariana worked, Date America, was located in a commercial complex in Vila Olympia, on a high floor from which a considerable slice of the São Paulo skyline could be seen. It was a functional office, without that startup aesthetic that had become mandatory in much of the sector. Organized desks, meetings with defined agendas, a clear but not oppressive hierarchy. Mariana liked this environment precisely because it didn't try to be what it wasn't. Her direct boss, Sandro Merilis, was a 50-year-old man who had spent half his career in research institutes before founding Data America with 2 partners. He had the type of intelligence that didn't need an audience and knew how to recognize the same characteristic in others. He was the one who most respected Mariana's way of working, and it was he who, on a Monday morning, called her for a conversation that would change the direction of the following weeks. Sandra wanted her to lead a digital communication behavior audit project for a new client. The task involved tracking patterns in beauty and cosmetics campaigns to identify practices that could generate reputational risks. It was exactly the type of analytical work she mastered, and it was, coincidentally, the exact sector where the Loose campaign was being built. She accepted without hesitation. The project would bring her legitimate access to network monitoring tools, influence databases, and sector reports that she otherwise would not have in hand. It wasn't a shortcut. It was a convergence, the type of alignment she had learned to recognize as rare and not to waste. In the first 2 weeks, Mariana dove into the project with the dedication Sandra expected. She mapped competitor campaigns, identified artificial engagement patterns, and produced a first preliminary report that the client approved enthusiastically. Meanwhile, on the margins of her formal work, she continued her own parallel analysis. What she was building was not an accusation. It was a web of visible connections, public data, contradictory statements, patterns identifiable by any analyst with time and method. She organized everything in a personal document, separate from anything related to work, which grew with the precision of an academic research file. It was during this process that she found Cecilia Faro. Cecilia was a journalist, specializing in communication and the advertising market. She had a weekly column in an economy and media portal that was read by professionals in the sector with real attention, not just out of obligation. Mariana had come across an article of hers about transparency in digital advertising in a sector portal, and the text was precise, well-founded, and with that rare ability to translate market behaviors without oversimplifying them. There was no immediate contact. Mariana kept the name. Meanwhile, Raphael had tried to get in touch. A short message, 10 days after the breakup, saying only that he hoped she was well and that he missed talking to her. Mariana read it, did not respond, and filed the message in the same mental folder where she kept everything that didn't need immediate action. What she didn't expect was to run into him. On a Wednesday afternoon, she was leaving a meeting with a client in Jardines when she saw him across the sidewalk, talking on the phone with that posture of someone carrying the weight of a difficult negotiation. He didn't see her. She observed him for a few seconds, not with longing, but with that clinical attention that was her nature. She noticed he was visibly tense, more than normal. She passed by without approaching. That night, for reasons she attributed to the need for context and not to any feeling, she checked the professional profiles of Raphael and Isabella. Raphael's LinkedIn activity was reduced, which was unusual for someone who used to post regularly about agency cases. Vertice's profile had removed a post about the Loose campaign that had been up for weeks, and Loose's Instagram had discreetly changed the direction of its content campaign, replacing influencer posts with institutional content. Something had moved. Mariana didn't know yet what had happened, but she had learned that when the ground moves before you act, it means others are also looking. She went back to Cecilia Faro's article and this time read the journalist's full biography. There was a contact email for story suggestions. Mariana opened a blank document. She stared at it for almost 10 minutes. Then she began to write, with the care of someone who knows that every word carries weight. She didn't accuse anyone. She only described a pattern that a specialized journalist might find interesting to investigate. She used technical language, referenced public data, and ended with a rhetorical question about the consistency between discourse and practice in certain campaigns in the beauty sector. She didn't sign it with her name. She used an email address created long ago for newsletter subscriptions, with no identifiable link to her. Before sending, she reread it 3 times. She adjusted 2 passages that seemed more loaded with intent than she wanted. She left only what was verifiable, what could be found by anyone with method and curiosity. She sent it. Then she closed her laptop, went to the kitchen, cut a mango, and ate it on the balcony while listening to the distant noise of the city. The apartment in Brooklyn had a modest view, a cluster of residential buildings, and further back a narrow strip of orange sky as the sun finished setting. She didn't feel relieved. She didn't feel anxious. She felt for the first time in weeks completely aligned between what she thought and what she had done. She had planted something. She didn't know how long it would take to grow. She didn't know if it would grow. But there was something genuine in that gesture. It wasn't an attack. It was the restitution of information to the public space where it should have always been. What people did with it was no longer her responsibility. Or at least that was what she repeated to herself as the sky darkened over the buildings of Brooklyn and the mangoes slowly finished in her fingers. But she knew, with that silent honesty she kept only for herself, that there was a difference between not controlling the result and pretending the result didn't matter. And that difference, for now, she still didn't have the courage to look at head-on. Cecilia Faro was 41 years old, had a small apartment in Pinheiros, full of books stacked with no apparent system, and the habit of answering emails at 11 at night when most people were already asleep. She had been a journalist for 15 years and had developed over that time an almost physical instinct for recognizing when information had the substance of truth behind a vague surface. The email that arrived that week had no name, no phone number, and no definitive statement. It was built on questions and references to data that anyone could find with basic research. But the structure was too precise to be from someone without a method. There was a pattern of analytical reasoning there that she recognized immediately. Someone knew something, and knew how not to say it directly. Cecilia replied to the email with a single line. "If you have more context, I am available to talk in complete confidentiality." Then she went to get coffee and stood thinking as the city woke up outside the window. In the following days, she began her own investigation. It wasn't difficult to find the contradictions that the email pointed out in oblique language. The interview with the Loose director was public. The movement of the micro-influencers had identifiable patterns. And there was a detail that she herself hadn't connected before. Loose had a partnership with the Transparency in Advertising Institute, an organization that worked directly with the National Council for Advertising Self-Regulation. If the campaign were confirmed as veiled advertising, the damage would not just be reputational, it would be institutional. Cecilia called 2 industry sources who always spoke off the record. One confirmed there had been rumors about the project for weeks. The other said Vertis was doing dangerous things with Loose and that he didn't want his name associated with anything. She had enough to start writing, but not enough to publish. She lacked an identifiable source or a document. Meanwhile, in the parallel universe that Mariana did not see, the gears had begun to turn. Raphael had noticed the change in the air before any formal announcement. Vertis's account director had called an extraordinary meeting on a Monday morning with the specific tone of someone about to give news that no one wants to hear. Isabella was present, arms crossed, with that composure that Raphael had learned to recognize as a sign that she was afraid but wasn't going to show it. The meeting lasted 40 minutes. The client, Luce, had received an informal inquiry from the Transparency Institute about the nature of the campaign. Nothing official, just a question from an institute interlocutor who had heard something. Luce's communications director was in a silent panic, and Vertice was being put in a position to justify creative choices that, seen from the wrong angle, looked exactly like what they were. Isabella took control of the room. She said it was just speculation, that nothing was proven, that the agency's positioning was solid. But Raphael, sitting 2 places away from her, noticed something she couldn't control, the imperceptible tremor in her voice when she said the word solid. That night, Raphael stayed in the office until 9 o'clock, rereading contracts and searching for any loophole that could serve as an anchor if things worsened. He found nothing that protected him specifically. He had been the account manager for the project. He had signed strategy approval documents. It was that night that he thought of Mariana for the second time since the breakup. Not sentimentally, practically. She had asked a question months ago that at the time seemed like mere intellectual curiosity. What if someone found out before the launch? He had dismissed it with a shrug. Now, that question had a different weight. There was no way she could know. It was impossible. It was coincidence. But the question remained. Mariana, meanwhile, had received a response from Cecilia Faro. She read the single line carefully and spent a few minutes with her phone in her hand, thinking. Responding meant taking a step that had more defined consequences. Not responding meant leaving the process to what had already been planted. She chose to respond, but in an equally careful way. She said she had no documents, no formal proof, and could not be identified. What she had was a method of analysis and public data, organized in a way that could be useful for someone who knew what to do with it. If Cecilia wanted to receive the document she had compiled, she just had to confirm a secure channel. Cecilia confirmed in less than an hour. Mariana spent the next night reviewing the document she had built in the previous weeks. She removed any element that could be traced back to her. She checked every reference, every link, every piece of data. The result was a clean, technical map, completely based on public information, but organized with a precision that made the pattern, invisible to the common eye, absolutely explicit to those with training. She sent it at 11:40 at night. Then she went to sleep. The curious thing is that she slept well, better than she had slept in weeks, not with the heavy satisfaction of someone who got revenge, but with the specific relief of someone who organized something that was in disorder. Like when a spreadsheet with inconsistent data finally closes with the correct references. There was something she hadn't predicted, however. Cecilia Faro was good at what she did. Very good. And when a journalist of that caliber receives a precise analytical map like the one Mariana had sent, she doesn't just follow the indicated path. She begins to understand where the map came from. And the question of who had drawn that map and why began to be as interesting as the destination it pointed to. That same night, Cecilia opened a new document and wrote a single line at the top, followed by a question mark. Data analyst? And she stared at it for a long time. The story was published on a Tuesday morning, 23 days after the initial email. Cecilia had taken the time she needed. She had checked every point, heard industry sources, obtained an off-the-record statement from one of the micro-influencers involved in the campaign, who confirmed the covert payment and the scripted briefing. She had also found on her own an internal Vertice presentation document that had been leaked anonymously to another journalist months before, without anyone knowing what to do with it. With the context provided by Mariana's map, that document finally made complete sense. The title of the article was direct. Loose campaign used veiled advertising while brand promised total transparency, and below the title, the subtitle that cut through the sector like a knife. Vertice agency orchestrated strategy that contradicts public commitment signed by the brand with a Consumer Protection Institute. Cecilia had published it in the economy portal where she had her column, but the text was republished by 2 communication portals and 1 business portal still on Tuesday morning. By noon, it was circulating in WhatsApp groups of advertising and marketing professionals across the country. Mariana learned of the publication when Dora, her desk neighbor, appeared at 9 in the morning with her phone in hand and said, "Did you see this? Scandal at Vertice." Mariana took Dora's phone, read the title with careful attention, and returned it with a neutral expression. She said only, "Interesting," and went back to the spreadsheet she was analyzing. What happened in the following hours, Mariana learned in fragments, the way news arrives when one is on the outside of a situation, through the filter of what others comment, what appears on social media, and what goes up on news portals throughout the day. Luce issued a note in the morning, saying it was investigating the facts. By early afternoon, the note had been replaced by another, longer one, which recognized that there was inconsistency between the communication strategy adopted by the partner agency and the values declared by the brand. The statement terminated the contract with Vertice with immediate effect. Vertice, in turn, issued a note signed by the management that was the type of text drafted by lawyers with express instructions not to admit anything. It spoke of an internal analysis underway, commitment to ethical communication practices, and openness to dialogue with the competent bodies. There were no names, but those who knew the agency knew exactly who had led the project. Isabella Coutinho deleted the articles about authenticity from her LinkedIn profile that afternoon. The removal was noticed by at least 3 industry professionals who shared screenshots with ironic comments. Mariana saw the screenshots. She didn't comment on anything. On Wednesday afternoon, Cecilia published a second text. This one focused on Isabella's profile and the contradiction between her public positions on ethical communication and her creative leadership in the Loose project. The text was legally careful but implacable in terms of internal logic. It cited Isabella's own words from articles and interviews, confronted with what sources confirmed had happened. The sector responded with that specific mixture of performative scandal and veiled satisfaction that happens when someone who occupied a position of prestige falls publicly. There were posts of repudiation and in private messages between the same authors of those posts, comments that Mariana never saw but imagined with precision. Raphael, who had called Mariana 3 days before the publication without leaving a message, tried again on Thursday, this time with a text. "I need to talk to you, seriously." She didn't respond. What she didn't expect was to run into him on Friday afternoon, by one of those urban coincidences that São Paulo seems to provide with specific irony, in the line of a cafe in Vila Olympia, 2 blocks from her office. He was with a laptop under his arm, and the expression of someone carrying more than the physical weight of the equipment. When he saw her, Raphael stopped. There was something different there from the last time they met at the Fasano. That night, he had looked at her with the gentle condescension of someone who believes himself to be at an advantage. Now, there was another thing in his look. It wasn't guilt, exactly. It was something closer to the late recognition that he had underestimated something, without yet fully understanding what. She ordered her coffee without deviating from the line. He waited beside her until she finished the order and then said, quietly, "A lot has happened. Do you know what's going on at Vertis?" Mariana took the coffee when they called her name, turned the lid to check if it was well closed, and replied without looking at him, "I read the market portals normally." Raphael was silent for a moment. Then he said, "Isabella was dismissed today." Mariana raised her eyes to him, not with surprise, with attention. He continued, "I'm still at the agency, but I'm being kept out of important projects while the situation is not resolved. It could take months, or not be resolved." She said, "I'm sorry." And there was something genuine in that. Not for what he had lost in terms of position or comfort, but because she recognized that choices have a cost, and that the cost rarely chooses the moment to arrive. He asked if she could have that coffee with him, that he needed to talk to someone he trusted. Mariana looked at him for a full second. Then she said, "Not today." She turned and left along the sunny sidewalk of Vila Olympia, the hot coffee in hand, the brown leather bag on her shoulder, her steps in the same rhythm as always. And for the first time in weeks, there was nothing else to process. There was only the afternoon, the coffee, and the city pulsing around as if the world had turned exactly as much as it needed to turn. In the days that followed, Mariana observed the unfolding of the situation with the same disciplined distance with which she had followed the beginning of everything. She didn't participate in corridor conversations at the office about the Vertice case, but she listened. She didn't comment on social networks, but she read. There was something almost comfortable in this edge position, in this place of someone who knows more than she shows. What she hadn't calculated was that Cecilia Farrow would continue investigating. The journalist had published 3 texts about the case, and, with each new text, the analysis became more precise, more surgical. There was clearly a primary source behind that material, someone with access to information that went beyond what was publicly available and who had organized it with an analyst's method. Cecilia wouldn't reveal the source, of course, but there were people in the sector who were asking the same questions she had asked that night in Pinheiros. Raphael was one of them. He had stopped trying to contact Mariana after the meeting at the cafe, but he had begun systematically to try to reconstruct the timeline. When the campaign had started to leak, who knew about the project? And more specifically, who knew about the project and would have a reason to want it to come to light? The list was small. On a Monday morning, 3 weeks after the publication of the article, Mariana received a message from Raphael that was different from the previous ones. "No, I need to talk," or "Do you have a moment?" It was straight to the point, with that efficiency of someone who had stopped beating around the bush. "I know it was you." She read the message twice. Then she put her phone in her bag and went to get coffee. When she returned, she had the necessary clarity to think. Raphael didn't know. He couldn't know. What he had was suspicion, perhaps intuition, perhaps the sum of some details that made sense together only if you put them in the right order. But intuition was not proof, and she had been careful enough so that there was no proof. Still, the message changed something. There was a difference between being ignored as irrelevant and being suspected of having acted. The first was uncomfortable. The second carried a different weight, bringing with it the possibility that her professional life would be associated with something she didn't want associated publicly. She needed to think. That week, the case gained a new dimension when the Transparency and Advertising Institute issued a formal statement requesting that Luce present documentation about the campaign for evaluation. It wasn't a lawsuit, it was an inquiry. But the market read it as what it was, the beginning of scrutiny that would not end quickly. Two other Vertice professionals were preventively sidelined. Raphael was not among them, but the proximity left marks. Clients he had cultivated for years began to respond to his emails with that delayed cordiality of someone who is waiting to see before committing. It was in this context that Cecilia Faro contacted Mariana. Not through the anonymous address, through the professional email at Data America, with a polite and professional email saying she was working on a series of reports about data analysis applied to the auditing of communication practices, and that she would like to talk to a specialist in the sector. There was no mention of the Vertice case. There was no insinuation. It was just a standard journalistic invitation. Mariana sat with the email open on the screen for a considerable time. Cecilia was smart. She was building a layer of legitimacy for the meeting that didn't leave Mariana in a position to refuse without raising suspicion. If she refused, the very act of refusing could be interpreted as confirmation. If she accepted, she would need to sit at the table with the person who had received the map she herself had drawn. There was something almost admirable in the move. Mariana replied that she accepted the conversation and proposed a time the following week at a cafe in Pinheiros that was a few blocks from the journalist's office, according to her social networks. The meeting took place on a Thursday afternoon with that São Paulo sun that appears when you least expect it and heats up more than predicted. Cecilia Faro was exactly as Mariana had imagined from the texts, compact, direct, with eyes that asked questions before her mouth did. She arrived 2 minutes before the agreed time and already had her notepad open on the table, which was both professionalism and a sign of intention. They talked for almost an hour and a half. About data analysis, about communication audit methodologies, about the digital influence market. Cecilia asked good technical questions, the kind that only someone who had done real research could ask. Mariana replied with precision and without excess. At no point was the name Vertice mentioned. At no point was there a reference to the case. But there was a moment near the end of the conversation when Cecilia stopped writing in the notepad, laid down her pen carefully, and looked directly at Mariana. She said, "You are very good at what you do." Mariana said, "Thank you." And Cecilia looked at her for exactly 3 seconds longer than necessary for a casual comment. Then she picked up the pen again and said she would get in touch if she needed any more technical context for the series of reports. On the way back, walking along the sidewalks of Pinheiros with the afternoon already cooling, Mariana thought there was something strange about being seen by someone who looked with the same type of attention she used to look at others. It was at once uncomfortable and, against all expectations, a bit like recognition. And recognition, she had recently learned, was a feeling she missed more than she had admitted. Raphael Drummond was not the type of man who gave up on a narrative once he had begun to build it. It was part of what made him good at advertising, the ability to hold a thread and pull until the entire story came along. The problem was that this time, the thread he held led to a person who had learned a long time ago not to leave loose threads. He appeared in the lobby of the Data America building on a Wednesday afternoon without prior notice. Mariana knew, because the receptionist sent a message on the internal system saying there was a man named Raphael Drummond asking to speak with her without an appointment, claiming it was a personal matter. She stared at the message for a moment. Then she told the receptionist she would be down in 10 minutes. She used those 10 minutes with precision. She saved the file she was working on, closed 2 browser tabs containing materials that didn't need to be seen by anyone, drank the rest of the coffee that had gone cold on the table, and went down. Raphael was in the lobby with that eternal laptop under his arm, but there was something different in his posture. The stature she had admired at the beginning of the relationship, that natural presence that filled rooms, was slightly compressed, as if he were occupying less space than usual. She proposed they go to the cafe on the corner of the building. It was neutral territory, public enough so that nothing would get out of control, close enough so that she could return quickly if she needed to. They sat at a corner table. He ordered an espresso he didn't drink. She didn't order. Raphael went straight to the point, which she respected even without liking what she heard. He said he had spoken with people at the agency, had reviewed the history of internal communications, and had reached the conclusion that the leak that had fed Cecilia Faro's investigation had come from someone who knew the project from the inside, but was not a Vertice employee. The list of people in that category was small, and there was only one who also had a personal reason for the situation to come to light. He said her name as a statement, not as a question. Mariana listened. She kept her eyes on him without looking away, without getting ahead of herself, without filling the silence he had left for her to speak. He continued, "I'm not here to create trouble. I'm here because I need to understand what happened. My career is at risk, Mariana. I wasn't the one who created that campaign. I was the one who signed documents without questioning enough. There is a difference." She said carefully, "There is a difference, yes." He asked, "Was it you?" And there was the question. Clean, direct, without beating around the bush. The type of question that only has 2 possible paths, and that, whatever the answer, changes something between the people involved. Mariana was silent for a moment that seemed longer than it was. Then she said, "What I can tell you is that I didn't invent anything. I didn't falsify anything, and I didn't accuse anyone of anything." Raphael opened his mouth slightly as if to speak, but she continued. What existed were facts available to anyone with method and attention. If someone organized them and delivered them to a journalist who knew what to do with them, that person didn't create the situation. The situation already existed. They just stopped protecting it. There was a silence. Raphael looked at the espresso he hadn't drunk, then at the table, then at her with an expression she hadn't seen in him before. It wasn't anger. It wasn't accusation. It was something that stood halfway between recognition and shame. He said slowly, "I said a cruel thing to you that night." She didn't respond. He continued, "I said you were too ordinary for my world. That was cruel and it was stupid. And I said it because Isabella had said I needed someone with more presence in the sector, and I let her opinion be worth more than 6 months of everything we built." Mariana looked at him for a long moment, and then she said, with an honesty that surprised even her, "The problem wasn't what you said. The problem was that you needed her opinion to know what I was worth to you. If you had known on your own, her opinion wouldn't have mattered." Raphael stayed quiet. She took her bag. She said she needed to get back to work, that she genuinely felt for the position he was in, that he hadn't been the architect of the campaign, and that there were people at the agency more responsible for what had happened than him, but that the consequences of choices rarely distinguished between who invented the problem and who decided not to ask questions about it. Then she said, already standing, "As for the rest, if someone sent information to a journalist, that person committed nothing that could be shown to be wrong. Public information remains public, regardless of who organizes it." He asked in a low voice, "So you won't confirm or deny?" She said, "I'm returning your question with a question. Was what happened really serious enough for you to want to hold someone responsible for the fact that it came to light? Or is it serious only because it affected the world you told me I wasn't enough to occupy?" Raphael didn't answer. She left along the Villa Olympia sidewalk at her usual pace with the hot and noisy afternoon of São Paulo around her. without looking back. There was nothing to see, just a man sitting at a cafe table with a cold espresso and a question he hadn't managed to answer in time. And unanswered questions, she had learned, usually do more work than any direct confrontation. The twist that Mariana had not predicted arrived in the form of a phone call from Sandro Meireles on a Friday afternoon, when she was already tidying her desk for the weekend. He said he needed to talk to her, that he had received a call from a new, very relevant client, and that her name had been mentioned directly. The client was Luz. Mariana stood motionless for a second. Then she said she was coming up to his office. The story, as Sandro explained, was as follows. Luz was trying to rebuild its image after the scandal. They had fired the communications director who had approved the Virtus campaign, hired a temporary crisis consultancy, and were seeking partners to develop a new communication positioning based on real consumer behavior data. Transparent, auditable, with a clear methodology. The person who had recommended Data America for this task had said specifically that what they needed was someone who understood patterns and who wouldn't let themselves be impressed by narrative when the numbers said something else. The name that had made the recommendation was Cecilia Faro. Mariana listened to everything with attention and then remained silent for a moment that Sandro knew how to respect. She said, "I need a day to think." Sandro said, "Of course, but it's a real opportunity, and you would be the one responsible for the project." She went back to her desk, sat down and stared out the window. The Villa Olympia skyline was turning gold with the late afternoon light, that specific gold of São Paulo that makes the city seem gentler than it usually is. Cecilia had made a choice. She hadn't exposed Mariana. She hadn't used what she had probably discovered. She had, instead, made a professional recommendation that placed Mariana exactly at the center of a reconstruction that had begun indirectly with the map she had sent. It was a move that said more than any direct statement could say. That weekend, Mariana walked in Ibirapuera on both days, something she rarely did. On Saturday, she let her thoughts arrange themselves, as usual. By Sunday, she had already made the decision. She would accept the project, not out of ambition, not out of a need for closure, but because there was something coherent about being the person who helped rebuild what had collapsed. Not out of guilt, which she didn't feel in a simple way, but because there was a logic in a cycle that begins with information and ends with the construction of something more honest. On Monday, she contacted Cecilia through her professional address and wrote, "I received the recommendation. Thank you. Can we talk?" Cecilia replied in half an hour, "Yes, but this time without the notepad." They met at the same Pinheiros Café as before. Cecilia arrived 2 minutes early, as last time, but this time without the notepad and with a different expression. More relaxed, like someone who had shifted from the position of journalist to the position of a person. Cecilia said she had discovered who the anonymous source was relatively early in the process, not by identity directly, but by method. The analytical precision of the document she had received was too specific. It had a clear intellectual signature, and when she had done research on data analysts in the sector who might have access to the context described, the path had led to a small set of possibilities. She also said she had made a choice. It was not the journalist's role to expose sources who had acted within what was legal and who had brought to light a situation of real public interest. And the recommendation to Luz had been, she said with a slight irony in her eyes, a way of seeing if the person on the other side was who she thought she was. Mariana said, "And am I?" Cecilia said, "You are someone who would have personal motives for doing what you did, but who did it in a way that survives professional scrutiny. That is rare." There was something Mariana needed to say and had postponed long enough. She said, "There was a personal motivation. I won't pretend there wasn't." Cecilia replied, "I know, and that is exactly what makes the story human." Then she added more seriously, "But you also knew that what was there was real and that there were people who needed to know. Personal motivation and public interest are not mutually exclusive. The question is what you did with them." Mariana was silent for a moment. There was something liberating and at the same time uncomfortable about being read with such precision by someone she had tried to keep at an informational distance. She said, "There is one thing I still don't know how to process. I don't know if what I did was entirely clean. I know it was legal, I know it was true. But the border between acting on principle and acting out of a wound is still not completely clear to me." Cecilia looked at her for a moment. Then she said, "Maybe it doesn't need to be. Maybe what matters is that when the two things overlapped, you chose the path that didn't hurt anyone who hadn't chosen to hurt themselves." Mariana thought of Raphael, of the cold espresso, of the unanswered question. She thought of Isabella, who had built a career on a discourse that she herself had discarded at the first convenient business opportunity. She thought of Luce, which had made a public promise and then turned its back on it without hesitation. There were no heroes in the story. There were only choices and their weight. But there was something there, in that afternoon coffee with a journalist who had read her better than most people who had known her for years, that seemed like the beginning of something different. Not a cinematic redemption, not a clean narrative turn, just the kind of clarity that comes when you stop wondering what others see in you and start understanding what you actually are. Mariana ordered a coffee this time, and for the first time in months, she wasn't analyzing anything. She was just present. 3 months later, the Luce project was underway. Mariana had assembled a communication analysis methodology that the brand's management itself had called the most honest we have ever seen. It wasn't an empty compliment. The project mapped the real behavior of consumers, identified genuine points of contact with the brand, and built a repositioning narrative based on verifiable data, without artificial dramatization, without fabricated personas, and without the illusion of spontaneity that had cost so dearly. It was work she liked, work that made sense. Date America had grown from this project. 2 new clients from the beauty sector had sought out the consultancy after the launch of the first results of the partnership with Luce, which had been presented in a sector forum with total methodological transparency. Sandro had proposed that Mariana take on a strategic project coordination position, which she had accepted after a day of reflection that, by her standards, was almost impulsive. Cecilia had published over this period 4 more texts about the Vertice case, which together had become a reference in debates on ethics in digital communication in Brazil. The last of them had briefly mentioned, without identification, the importance of independent analysts in detecting practices that formal oversight mechanisms rarely reached. It was a phrase Mariana had read 3 times and then closed the computer. She didn't need more than that. Raphael had changed agencies. He was at a smaller house, more focused on institutional communication, where the pace was different and the pressure for spectacular results had dropped to a level that he was apparently finding more sustainable. She learned this from LinkedIn, which she consulted a single time, for no specific reason she could clearly articulate. She didn't try to make contact. There was no need. Isabella had temporarily left the advertising market. There was a profile of hers somewhere that said she was in a period of transition and reformulation, which the sector translated in the way it usually translates such moves. Whatever happened next was her story to tell. On an afternoon in August, Mariana went to Ibirapuera alone, as usual, but this time without the function of reorganizing thoughts that were in disorder. She had realized with some surprise that she had reached a state she didn't immediately recognize because it was unusual for her. Things were simply fine. Not perfectly resolved, not without ambiguity. There was still that question she had admitted to Cecilia at the cafe, the border between principle and wound that had never become completely clear. She had learned to live with this lack of clarity without trying to force an answer that time had not yet matured. What she knew was simpler than it seemed. She had acted within what she could defend, with information that was real, in a way that had not invented or distorted anything. The rest had been the consequence of the choices of those who had made bad choices. And there was another thing she had learned, perhaps the most important, that disappearing when someone decides you have no value is not resignation. It is the refusal to compete for a space that shouldn't need to be competed for. And that sometimes the silence that comes after that disappearance speaks louder than any argument could. She sat on the same bench near the lake where she had stopped months before, when the ducks were still circling with that calm of those who don't know they are observed. The ducks were still there. She smiled slightly at them, which was a novelty. Mariana Vasconcelos didn't usually smile at ducks, but August in São Paulo had those moments. Brief, unexpected, completely free. She stayed there for a while without processing anything, without analyzing anything, letting the park just be the park around her. And then she thought, sometimes what seems like the end of something is just the clarity that it should never have been the beginning. And what seems like the beginning of something new is, in fact, just you getting closer to who you already were, before letting someone convince you that you needed to be different to have value. She stayed for another 20 minutes, then stood up, adjusted the brown leather bag on her shoulder, and left along the path at her usual pace. São Paulo continued around her, immense and indifferent, and absolutely uninterrupted, as it always was. And inside it, Mariana Vasconcelos moved on, whole, precise, present, exactly who she had always been. If this story touched something in you, if you recognized yourself at some point in Mariana's journey, or if you simply stayed here until the end because you couldn't stop, know that this is exactly the type of connection this channel was created to provoke. Stories that don't have perfect heroes, that live in the complicated space between what is right and what is human, between the wound and the choice. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, this is the moment, because the next story is already being prepared with the same care, the same depth and the same commitment to everything that makes us truly human. Leave your like, which tells the algorithm that content with substance matters, and write in the comments, would you have done what Mariana did? There is no wrong answer. There is only your answer. And it is exactly the beginning of a conversation we want to have with you. End of story.